This is one of the most powerful scenes from Final Fantasy VII, maybe one of the most powerful scenes I've seen from any game, and there are a lot of reasons for this. One of the biggest reasons I think Aerith's death was so impactful for a lot of gamers was that even though Aerith's death was foreshadowed, it was still really shocking when it happened. A lot of gamers played Final Fantasy VII when they were kids, and a lot of them were new to Final Fantasy and JRPGs, so they didn't expect anything like this to happen to one of the main characters, specifically a character like Aerith, but her death being shocking wasn't the only reason why it was sad. Aerith was a character that you spent several hours getting to know. She was funny and caring and kind. She had a tragic backstory that made you connect with her. She was just a really great character, and so to kill her off like this was just brutal. Of course, things have changed a lot since Final Fantasy VII first came out. Aerith's death, while still heartbreaking, isn't really shocking. A good amount of gamers already know that Aerith dies during the game, even if they haven't played it. Case in point, I knew Aerith died years before I played Final Fantasy VII, and yet even though I saw her death coming, I still found her death to be super moving. The scene is just so well done and well presented, and the song that plays in the scene, Aerith's theme, is such a powerful song, and it's one of my favorite songs from the whole game. But I think another reason is just that I loved her character, and I think her death made her even more compelling than she already was. She wasn't just a potential love interest for our hero, she was the hero. A tragic hero who ended up saving everyone in the end. Her death also helped to showcase the themes of Final Fantasy VII, which to me are life and death. Life is precious, and at some point you'll lose people you love, and that's something that you'll have to grapple with. Death, whether expected or unexpected, always hits hard. It leaves you with this feeling of emptiness and sorrow. So value life because it's beautiful. And when you do lose people, always know that they live on inside you. Just because they've passed doesn't mean they're really gone. In an interview, Final Fantasy series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi talked about how it wasn't enough to make life the theme. You need to depict living and dying. In any event, you need to portray death. These are very mature themes, and I feel like Final Fantasy VII handled them very well, and these themes gave Final Fantasy VII a lot of emotional depth and maturity. And to me, these themes are one of the biggest reasons as to why Final Fantasy VII is so special. It tackled very adult themes of a narrative where everything that happened felt purposeful, and while the game did have many twists, the twists feel like they're there for more than just shock value. They help to develop the characters and the themes of the game. But I'm sure the developers wanted Aerith's death to be shocking. Aerith's death was written with the idea that it was something that would be sudden and unexpected. But since Aerith's death isn't a surprise anymore, it's missing the shock value. And I think shock and shock value are really important points right now to keep in mind when we get into the Final Fantasy VII Remake. When the Final Fantasy VII Remake was first announced back in 2015, I think it's fair to say that most gamers expected the story to be basically the same. You were going to get all the same beats and moments that you loved, just now with a modern coat of paint on it and a modern spin on it. Of course, as time went by, certain expectations changed. The remake was going to be split into parts, with the first part, Final Fantasy VII Remake, only covering the Midgar section of the original game. We knew that the Midgar story arc was going to be expanded on heavily, so that characters who didn't get much screen time in the original game now had better development. We found out that the game was going to be using a more action-based combat system in comparison of the original game. And we found out that Sephiroth was going to show up during the remake, even though he doesn't show up during the Midgar arc of the original game. Also, there are going to be these ghosts that weren't in the original game. Yet even with all of this, at the core, the expectation was that the narrative was going to be, generally speaking, the same moments, the same twists, the same beats. And that was generally true for most of the game. You got a lot of the same beats and the same moments from the original game. But one thing I noticed about these beats and moments is that they had been changed to the point where the impact just wasn't the same. Remember when the plate was dropped on Sector 7 and characters like Biggs and Wedge got killed? And you got this chilling, ominous scene where the plates dropped. In the remake, Biggs and Wedge both end up surviving, and unlike the original game where it feels like you basically save no one, in the remake it feels like you save basically everyone. Think about how much time you spent getting to interact with all these people in Sector 7. Killing off all these people would have been so dramatic and powerful. Instead, you get a sequence where you help evacuate everyone. Most of the people in Sector 7 it feels like probably survived, and instead of the scene where the plate drops being super dark and ominous, you get a scene like this. This scene in the remake just doesn't have the same impact as the original scene did, and who can forget one of the best scenes in the original game, the Trail of Blood scene. In the original game, this scene was almost perfect, partially because of the scene itself, but also because of the build-up to this scene. Since we don't see Sephiroth at all during the Midgar arc, he's a mysterious figure mentioned to us only in passing. Each time he's mentioned, we get a glimpse into who Sephiroth might be, but we don't get to think about Sephiroth for too long because Sephiroth isn't the main threat at this point during the game. Shinra is. The first few hours of the game help to show us just how big of a threat Shinra really is. We constantly see examples of just how evil, corrupt, and powerful Shinra is, with the dropping of the plate being one of the biggest examples of this. And when Cloud and the others go to rescue Aerith, they're caught and put in prison cells. Feels as if our heroes have lost and Shinra has won. After talking to each other a bit while in prison, they sleep, and when they wake up, no music plays initially until you find a dead soldier, and then this haunting, ominous score plays. None of them really know what's happening, and so you just have to go and make your way up to HQ, and you see a level of blood and carnage that's just horrifying. Bodies lying everywhere on the floor, blood is everywhere. Who or what could have done this? Eventually you find a President Shinra who's been completely impaled. Just a couple scenes ago we saw him and he was super confident, and now he's just dead. Typically the evil leader of a corporation is usually the ultimate bad guy, but here it gets taken out like he's nothing. And even though we've never seen Sephiroth, the fact that Sephiroth was able to take down the head of an evil and powerful corporation like Shinra that our heroes even couldn't take down just shows how powerful he really is. In the remake, the scene just isn't anywhere near as effective. Part of it is because of the worst setup. Because we see Sephiroth show up randomly throughout the remake, he loses a lot of the mystery that makes seeing his character for the first time so exciting. According to the Final Fantasy VII Remake producer and the original Final Fantasy VII director Yoshinori Kitase, the reason Sephiroth shows up in the remake despite having not shown up in the original game during the Midgar arc is that in the original game, players didn't really know the world or many of the game's characters, so he wanted to build up Sephiroth as this major threat. However, people already know who Sephiroth is, so we don't really need to go and hide him as much. While I get what Kitase is saying here, the idea that we already know who Sephiroth is, so there isn't as much of a point in hiding him, I have to disagree with him. Going back to what I said about Aerith's death earlier, I already knew she was going to die, and yet I found her death to be super effective even if the shock value was gone, because great storytelling can still be effective even if you already know what's happening. This, in addition to the plate falling scene being worse in the remake, makes the setup for the Trail of Blood scene being worse. Also in the original game, the Trail of Blood scene takes place after our heroes have been imprisoned by Shinra. In the remake, the Trail of Blood scene takes place after a filler dungeon. And when you do get to the Trail of Blood scene finally in the remake, there's no real blood, just Genova liquid, which is obviously there to maintain a T rating. And when you see the president, he isn't already impaled by Sephiroth's sword. Instead, he's hanging off of the roof, and we see Sephiroth kill him in front of us, which in my opinion just lacks the impact of finding the president already dead. But the scenes and moments I've mentioned in the video are based off the original game at the end of the day. Regardless as to whether or not these moments and scenes were well executed in the remake, these scenes and moments still stay true to the original game, at least in some sense. However, the remake does end up going into uncharted territory.
Careful now. That which lies ahead does not yet exist.
During Chapter 17, we find out that the ghosts we've been seeing throughout the remake are actually called Whisperers, or Arbiters of Fate, and they're trying to keep the timeline the same as the original game. Instead of the remake ending like how the Midgar section in the original game ended, with a motorcycle chase and our characters deciding to leave Midgar right after, now Sephiroth shows up and our characters have to go and fight him and the Arbiters of Fate. We get this honestly really cool and epic set-piece filled finale. The fight between Sephiroth and Cloud and the others really reminded me of Advent innocent children, in a good way, and when it's finally finished, our heroes have changed fate. The finale is pretty interesting because it does bring new ideas that weren't really a part of the original game, like Defying fate and destiny. Apparently the timeline from the original game, I guess, is sort of like the bad timeline.
What the hell did I just see?
A glimpse of tomorrow if we fail here today.
But the important thing is that now that fate has been changed, characters like Zack, who previously were dead, are now alive, and now anything can happen. Events that were key to the original game now might play out completely differently, or might just not happen at all, and we can now get new events and new story beats that we didn't get before because the journey ahead is now unknown. When it comes to Aerith, this means that there's a chance to save her. There's a chance Aerith might not have to die. On one hand, this is really cool because Aerith is such a beloved character, and the idea of still seeing her is really exciting. I've seen a lot of fans online talk about how they hope she lives. The original game made players get really attached to Aerith, and I think the remake did an even better job of getting you to latch onto her. Aerith no longer looks like a PS1 character of blocky polygons. Now she looks as realistic as you'd expect from a modern day Final Fantasy game, and Aerith is now fully voiced. Also, the remake gave us so much more screen time with Aerith. We got hours of gameplay where the only two main characters were Cloud and Aerith. I think all of these things have gotten people to get even more attached to her, so I could see why people want Aerith to come back. But on the other hand, I feel like having her live takes away from a large part as to what makes Aerith such a great character. Aerith had the hero's death. She didn't want to die, but her dying is what made her become a hero. I don't think people would have latched on to her as much if she didn't die. People would have liked Aerith, but would they have remembered her for all these years if she didn't die? I don't think so. Some of my favorite characters in a lot of games I've played are memorable to me in large part because those characters die. Their deaths give those characters meaning. It makes those characters stick out to you. Their deaths make their journeys feel all the more memorable. That's a large part of the reason why I love Zack. He's fun and caring and heroic, but plenty of other stories and movies, TV shows, and games have characters who are very similar to Zack. Zack dying, in my opinion, is part of the reason why he stood out. Him dying is part of the reason why he truly became a hero to me, and having Zack not die just takes away from that aspect of him. To me, Aerith not dying would be the same thing. I feel like having her live just strips out a core part of what makes her such a great character, but it's even more than that. Aerith's death isn't just important because it makes Aerith a better character. Aerith dying makes other characters in the game better too. One of the ways stories often help us relate to our main characters is to show them experience loss and traumatic situations so we can empathize with them. Final Fantasy VII does this a lot. Almost all the main cast of Final Fantasy VII have a backstory that's tragic in some way. In the beginning of the game, Cloud is this tough soldier who seems to not care about anyone and who seems to be apathetic. But throughout the game, we learned that he's someone who has PTSD and he's been through his fair share of traumatic life experiences. He's deeply human, and for me, Aerith's death is one of the biggest showcases of this. When Aerith dies, we see Cloud just break down and completely lose it. We feel so much for Cloud because we know how much Aerith meant to him, and so to see him lose Aerith like this makes us really feel for him, and I think it's moments like this that really make Cloud such a great character. Final Fantasy VII deals with grief quite a bit, and to me, Aerith dying is where you see this the most. Obviously, we see life being sucked out of the planet. We see other characters die throughout the game before Aerith, so we see loss throughout the game even before her death. But having a death that's this personal to us is where the game makes us really internalize loss, grief, and life, and the preciousness of life. And to me, the ideas brought up in the remake's ending, the ideas of defying destiny and changing fate, just sort of go against that.
But if we do, we'll be changing more than fate itself. If we succeed, if we win, we'll be changing ourselves.
When we lose people in life, this is something we're gonna have to accept and come to terms with. Real life is much more about accepting what's happened and accepting fate, and I think the original deals with this too. Many characters die in the original game, often in brutal ways, and that's that. Our heroes can't change it, our heroes just have to deal with it and move on. But in the remake, the opposite frequently seems to be the case. Characters seem like they're going to die, only to end up being okay, and when there is tragedy or the potential for tragedy, the solution is to just go through a portal and change fate. Think about the original game's ending, where we're not even sure if humans survived or not, because at the end of the day what mattered most was the life of the planet, and maybe humans who were killing the planet through greed, warmongering, and selfishness weren't good for the planet's survival. Maybe humans need to die so the planet could live. To me, those ideas seem very antithetical to the ideas of defying destiny, where when characters die, well, they're just alive now. Things that are sad and heartbreaking, well, those things can be just undone by walking through a portal and fighting some ghosts. And ideas hinted at the end of the remake, like multiple timelines and multiverse, and things along those lines, don't feel like they belong with the themes from the original game. These were never things the original game was about. Now, I know it seems like I'm being very critical of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it may even seem like I don't like the remake, but this video isn't me trying to dunk on the remake. I actually happen to love the remake, and I think overall it's an amazing game. And I think the remake really nailed a lot of aspects of the story. In fact, there are quite a few things story-wise I think the remake did better than the original. The characters felt so real in the remake. They somehow found a way to make these characters feel true to who they were in the original game, and yet also feel more normal in comparison to your typical JRPG characters. The game has so many nice, quiet moments that really help you get attached to everyone. Like this scene from Chapter 3 was one of my favorite scenes from the whole game.
Well, most people would say something sweet right about now.
I'm sure they would.
But you're a more discerning customer, aren't you? In which case... our house special, the Cosmo Canyon.
Beautiful.
It's such a nice moment between these characters, and the game is filled with so many moments like this. Characters who I didn't really care about in the original game, I cared quite a bit about in the remake. Like in the original game, I didn't care about Jesse, Biggs, or Wedge, but the remake made me really care about them. There were so many moments from the original game that I think the remake took and elevated. The remake has so many incredible moments that just weren't in the original game, and I do think the decision to have an entire game based in Midgar was actually a good idea. Midgar is just such a cool city with a unique vibe, and while Midgar doesn't feel as big as you'd expect the biggest city in the planet to be, it has a very cool atmosphere, and the combat is just amazing. It somehow managed to retain the ATB nature of the original game's combat while still being more action-packed to suit newcomers. I honestly think I prefer the remake's combat system over the originals, and the music is just incredible. And when it comes to the story changes, even though I'm criticizing a lot of these changes, I do think that they make the remake a more interesting game. Maybe the game staying closer to the original game's story might have made the game's story more cohesive and just better, but the remake going in this crazy direction makes it more fascinating. Whether the changes pay off or not, I do think it makes for some cool discussions. I think it's really cool to see all these people post theories online and speculating about where the remake is gonna go, and I think that if the remake story was just the same as the original game story, you wouldn't get all this engagement and discussion. People wouldn't have engaged in the remake story if it was just the same as the originals. I honestly don't think I would be as excited for what's gonna happen in Rebirth if it was just the same. One of the reasons I'm hyped for Rebirth is to see how the story is gonna play out. I think Aerith should die, but the fact that I don't know if she's gonna die or not makes me really eager to play Rebirth. So even if the remake trilogy's story ends up being worse than the original game's story, at least it's gonna be a more interesting story. It makes the story have more to it instead of just being the story we already know. And even if you don't like the story in the remake, at least the original game is still out there and easily accessible. Square Enix hasn't pulled the George Lucas of Final Fantasy VII. You can still access the original game, the one you remember playing as a kid. So if you don't like the remake story, you can just ignore it. For me though, I'm looking forward to Rebirth. The game looks gorgeous, the world seems big, much bigger than I thought it would be given how linear the remake was, and I can't wait to see what happens. But those are just my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think Aerith should die in Rebirth? Do you think she should live? What do you think is gonna happen in Rebirth? How hyped are you for Rebirth as a game? Comment below and let me know. Also, if you can, liking and subscribing to the channel would really help me out. I would really appreciate it if you did that. And I want to leave you with a scene that maybe will be relevant to Rebirth. I'm not sure yet, but it might be. Thanks. Bye.
You need to embrace this moment. Right?
I'm glad I met you, Cloud. I really am. I'm grateful for all the words we've shared, for all the moments and the memories. You've made me more happy than you know. And I'll always cherish what you've given me. But whatever happens, you can't fall in love with me. Even if you think you have, it's not real.
Do I get a say in all this?
It's almost morning. Time to go.
I'm coming for you.
If that's what you want. Thank you.